Good, well welcome everybody this evening for our panel discussion, which is on the second day of the Garden Biology course, and we're very delighted to have here this evening a very distinguished panel. I'm going to start from the right. We have Simon Conway Morris, who's Professor of Paleobiology here in Cambridge. We have Dr. Francis Collins. I always want to call Francis Professor, and I know you're not allowed to do that at the NIH, so Dr. Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, and Michael Ruse from Florida State University, and philosopher.
You call me Professor, it's okay.
Professor. And also Professor Ron Adams from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who is a historian. So we're really covering a lot of bases here. And we've got the four speakers who've been speaking to us during the first day or so of our Garden Biology course. Thank you everybody for putting in such a great pile of questions, which will keep us going all night if we really wanted to, but we're not going to do that. So we may have to be a little selective tonight. Apologies in advance if we don't actually get to your question. People can circle, as you may have noticed, particular names on here, which doesn't mean to say the other members of the panel can't contribute, obviously. But I'm going to start here with a question for Francis Collins. You say the language of God is the genetic code. What about the language of mathematics or poetry? Are there not several languages? The consequence of a number of languages would be that there are several ways of talking about reality, not just the scientific language. Do you agree?
Well, I love that question. I think that's actually quite thoughtful, and it has occurred to me that a mathematician who's also a believer might be offended by my description of DNA as filling this mission, since there's so many other ways in which mathematics speaks to us of God's mind, the way that God has put together the universe in a rational fashion that can be described with equations that are not only simple but quite beautiful. And so music, perhaps, again, I think is something that elevates many of us out of the sort of tawdry experiences of daily life into some other plane that is difficult to describe, and which is, in a certain way, also a glimpse of something eternal, something profound, something spiritual. Might be also, I suppose, considered another language. So, as a biologist, as a geneticist, I guess I've migrated in this direction of talking about DNA because it is maybe more familiar to us in the sense that it has an alphabet. It has only 4 letters in its alphabet, A, C, G, and T. It has a syntax, it has a grammar. It can be thought of as a book. And so it does fit rather naturally into this metaphor. But the metaphor is both problematic in the sense that it doesn't fully describe the elegance, the intricacy, the awe that's conveyed by the study of DNA and its contribution to living things. And it also sounds a little exclusivist, which I think the question points to. So point well taken. I think we could easily expand the list of languages of God into a much longer list. I've only mentioned a few. Others could undoubtedly come up with additions to that list.
Any other members of the panel want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that one because I must say, e to the pi I equals -1 blows my mind. Why does this hold? Is this just an empirical generalization? Doesn't look like one. The question I want to ask, though, Francis, and I'm asking you, let me say, in a serious spirit, not in a Dawkins spirit, if you understand.
Thank God for that.
I mean, why would one take a divine position on this, or a divine causal position, rather than, and I like your, because I call myself a skeptic, not a diagnostic, why not just simply say, well, that's the way that things are. Maybe there is a Platonic heaven. It's not necessarily a God Platonic heaven. Maybe that's just the way that things are, and it's no more, no less mysterious than the DNA molecule.
So I think one can take that position, and many people, including yourself, do so and feel that that is the end of the discussion. And it was my certain perspective when I was a graduate student doing quantum mechanics, where everything about the marvels of mathematical abilities to describe the way that the universe works just seemed to be the way they were. And I didn't give it a whole lot of thought at that point. I think the arguments for me about theism did not come solely from that perspective. Once I began to consider the idea of a creator God, this seemed to be another one of those pointers that could be factored into the decision. But it's certainly not a proof. certainly wouldn't convince anybody who didn't have other reasons, I think, to look at the possibility of God's existence. So my own sense of how people come to be believers in a personal God is that you can get a certain distance with these kinds of intellectual arguments, but at some point you have to basically decide, I'm not going to get all the way there. And that's what I found happening to myself in my 28th year. And that really required then for me a decision. Am I going to stop at this point, retaining this sort of perspective of that's interesting, and I'm a skeptic, but I'm not convinced yet? Or had I reached the point where I could really no longer resist the conclusion? And I found I had reached that point, and I'm not sure I can completely put that into rational, rigorous intellectual terms, but it was very compelling and it remains so today, 30 years later. Kim?
Okay, I think thank you very much. We'll move on to the next question, which is actually directed towards Michael. You said that the new atheists are really old atheists. Could you explain?
Yes, I mean, by the new atheists, obviously I'm referring to Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, and of course most recently Christopher Hitchens. I mean, they're not new in their declared atheism. We've known that Dawkins is an atheist for a long, long time, for instance. What I meant by that was that I really don't see a lot of new arguments which are being launched there. There are some. I mean, Dan Dennett is offering a naturalistic account of religion, which he seems to think will then prove that religion is no longer true. Although, frankly, you find this in The Descent of Man, and of course you find it in David Hume. I mean, certainly a very strong precursor. But inasmuch as Dawkins has coherent arguments, and I'm not being entirely nasty here, I mean, really, it's not a very coherent book. Inasmuch as he does have coherent arguments, it seems to me that he's critiquing Christianity and religion on the basis of things like the problem of evil and the bad effects of religion. I mean, his discussion of the ontological argument is so incoherent that I'm not quite sure what he means there. But as I say, I don't see anything very new. More than that, what I don't see, and this is which cheeses me off, is any attempt to think about what I would say are the serious responses that Christians and others would make to a lot of these critiques. I mean, for instance, it's absolutely a fundamental part of much Christian theology that God is a necessary being. We are contingent. It's hard to imagine, but it is possible that one would have a world without wrong numbers. I say it is hard to imagine, but in Christian theology, and I'm not a Christian man, it's oh boy, it looks to kill. But in Christian theology, God must exist. Now, whether or not the idea of a necessary being makes sense is certainly something that philosophers argue about. But it's rather like selfish genes. If you're going to critique selfish genes, you should know what people mean by selfish genes when you set about doing this. And it's not enough to do as Mary Midgley once did and say, oh, well, genes aren't selfish, that's a silly argument, end of argument. I mean, that's ignorance. And I want to say that critiquing Christianity without knowing some of the basic moves that Christianity makes, and using just the arguments that, I don't know, dare I, full rank that public school boys like Dawkins and myself used in the 50s, is no longer good enough.
Anyone else want to add on to that? Or? Thank you for that clarification. I think this next one is now one for Simon. For kind of scientific question, really. It's sometimes said that there are no or few transitional forms. Is this true, and how strong is the evidence for transitional forms?
Oh gosh, where do you start? Well, I suppose one way to say is there have been, let us say, I don't know, 1 billion species alive since the beginning of life. It may be more, maybe less. And of course, the great majority, we have no information about any of those transitional forms. On the other hand, there's sufficient evidence that they all are descended by from a particular starting point. And if you're interested, which is perhaps where the question is trying to go, as to what are critical transitional forms, because if one's looking at how one beetle turns into another beetle, most people don't get very excited about that, though perhaps they should. But in terms of the sort of major gaps, as they're sometimes described, no, I don't think there's any particular problem there. For the most part, one can see how the transformations are achieved, but as I was trying to explain myself very briefly, in part one tends to forget that a great deal of it is actually reusing the tyre. One's retreading evolution the whole time. You don't have to reinvent very much at all. So for the person who asked the question, I wouldn't dream of asking him or her to stand up, but sort of give me the key example where you can't see the transformation. I think we could probably say we can. But no, as a general principle, I really wouldn't worry. It's not an area of weakness for evolutionary biology, I'm afraid.
Simon, do you just want to say a little bit about the evolution of birds from dinosaurs and that kind of whole transitional thing, that just to flag up a few examples from our own research in China?
Well, thank you. I mean, one can, of course, and of course the trouble with the origin of the birds in terms of flight is it's actually part of the great Humpty Dumpty principles. Were they pushed? In other words, did they actually fall out of the trees, or did they climb up the trees and then find themselves sort of losing balance and then gliding effortlessly down to an unsuspecting cockroach? And the point there is that in any one of these evolutionary cases we can invent a scenario which sounds very plausible. And in the case of flight, specifically in vertebrates, we have a slight problem in as much as the Archaeopteryx evidence can be interpreted in slightly different ways, other than we don't doubt the Archaeopteryx could fly. But correspondingly, we have no direct information to go back to the point, which is perfectly fair in its own way, as to how did bats learn to fly. We don't actually have an intermediate. I mean, clearly they're sort of rodent-like. But if you go to the other way of getting around the forest, which is gliding, that's been reinvented very many times, and there you can actually understand, including ants as it so happens, but that's another story, there you can understand what the constraints are. So, by all means, one can argue in detail, did Archaeopteryx run very fast and suddenly say, oh boy, I'm flying? Or was it up on the top of the tree and given a sharp push by somebody else and glided down? But in a certain sort of way, it really doesn't matter very much. I mean, what we see in that particular animal is it's got aerodynamic feathers. The feathers themselves may well have had a prior function. Many people think for sexual display. That may or may not be correct. So one can always reduce the thing to a specific set of arguments to do with the way in which the claw works, the way in which the forelin worked, the way in which the feathers worked. But what's clear is, from the Chinese evidence, is that there are a lot of dinosaurs wandering around with different sorts of thermoregulatory equipment on them. And most of them are there to keep them warm. But one couldn't be too surprised if every now and again they provide an aerodynamic advantage. That's, in a sense, is all you need, I think, to say.
Isn't it the case that many of the examples that people frequently cite, particularly in anti-evolutionist literature about gaps in the fossil record, are based upon information that's now a few decades old, and that there's been more discovered in terms of filling those gaps in the fossil record in the last 15 or 20 years than everything that came before? Is that an overstatement?
Well, I think that's fair enough. I mean, amongst most of the people who are scientists, one knows, as I think both of us are emphasising in complementary ways, I hope, is that one's information is always incomplete. Scientists don't worry about that particularly because we're dealing out with hypotheses. Per se, the facts are useful for the hypothesis, but the hypothesis matters. And in the case of the debate with those people who are emphasising these apparent gaps in evolution, you can always find a weak point in an argument. But as a scientist, you can always find a weak point in an argument. But that tells us nothing about the way we do our process. So yes, I think there's been substantial hypothesis because there are a large number of people working in relatively obscure parts of the world which fill in some of those gaps. But I would be wary, in a way, about in the sense, especially in the United States, but not exclusively there, is that one tends to find oneself being painted into corners the whole time. And I think in a certain sort of way, what Michael was saying is the problem. They assume you have a particular position which you never intended to adopt. And whatever you say, they say, well, that's not quite what we meant. Whereas the difference is completely different, because if you're a scientist, you're dealing with hypotheses the whole time. If you can take something in the fertile area, then you pursue it. If it runs out of steam, then you abandon it. And that's equally true, I would suggest, in theology.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, I think we'll move on to the next question, which is, I think I'm going to direct towards Ron on this occasion. Let's take for the whole panel. Is the increase in consumerism and individualism in Western culture based upon a Christian, Darwinian, or other philosophy? Something for the historian and the philosopher. So.
All of the above. Not only do I not know the answer, I would be highly suspicious of anybody who claimed to have the answer for this one.
Oh, right, Michael, you're in.
Ron's altogether too modest. I mean, I'm not sure that Ron wants to give us an analysis of the rise of consumerism or those sorts of things. Ron, of course, is one of the world's authority on the way and ways in which social things like the rise of consumerism or the failure of the rise of consumerism, backed perhaps by the coming of technology, of ways of education, and these sorts of things have certainly impinged on the development, if you like, of American religion. I mean, Ron, you'd certainly want to argue that, wouldn't you? That if we're going to talk about things like consumerism and that sort of thing, these are going to be issues which very quickly enter into the sorts of discourse that you write about, namely the development of, let's say, evangelical Protestant thinking about origins in the last 100 years.
And I especially wouldn't want to disagree with you.
No, of course.
Right.
Okay, anybody want to add anything else? That's a very broad
Expertise over here.
Okay, yeah, okay, well, we'll pass on from consumerism. Quite a big sociological question, I think. But here's one for Francis. In fact, I'm going to put these two together. I'll read them together. They're sort of related. When God said his creation was good, do you think this relates mostly to the opportunity for perfect relationships, despite, for example, aberrant DNA causing disease or infirmity? So that's sort of one side of the question. And then the second, this is not a different question, but surely the point of the human condition is that we are imperfect, and that through them, and by an exploration of them, I'm not sure what the end then is, but we become fully human by growing emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, and thus we attain higher forms. So there are kind of two sides of a similar point, but the first one really is about the concept of good creation and aberrant DNA. So, you want to start with that one? Or?
So I said this morning that I'm not an expert in either theology or philosophy, and these questions clearly tap into that. But I do believe that God's creation was good. I'm not a fan of alternative views of the demiurge version of creation. It seems to me that the simple, straightforward interpretation of that particular statement is that the elegance of the process that God put into place, including the creation of the entire universe, plus the evolutionary process that led to life on this planet, including human beings in his image, was a plan that was considered a good one, that was going to lead to really beautiful, wonderful, amazing outcomes, and it has. But I don't know that that has to therefore say that all of the creatures that resulted from this would live a complete life without pain or suffering or any other difficulties. And this gets us into theodicy fairly quickly about how could a good God tolerate the creation of a universe where there is suffering and death. And I think that has been posed by many people as a challenge. I think it is the toughest challenge for a believer to try to explain the answer to that. Is God not good enough? Does God not love us enough that he could have not set it up some other way so that this kind of pain and suffering would not occur? At the same time, I think the responses to that are many, and we already heard about some of them at this meeting in terms of the difference between the kinds of evil that come about on the basis of human actions, where the free will defense can be brought into it with a reasonable amount of clarity, versus the kinds of suffering that a child with cancer is experiencing, where you can't really identify that there was some human who did a bad thing to make this happen. and those are tougher. But it does seem to me that the process of evolution, which may have been, be interested in Simon's thoughts on this, the only way in which creation could have been accomplished, carried therefore with it the inevitability of these other kinds of experiences of physical evil, including tectonic plate slippage, including DNA mistakes that lead to people with genetic problems or with cancer as a result of somatic mutations. And maybe you can't have one without the other. And then you also have to step back, and again, I'm getting way out of an area where I should have any credibility, and ask the question exactly what is the meaning of suffering in a much larger eternal scale. And are we in fact, as creatures in this brief eye blink where we live on this planet, intended to go through life without those experiences? Or would that cause us to become shallow and not very well suited for whatever comes after, and not likely, therefore, to develop and sustain a relationship with God? Lewis talks about this in very colorful terms, that suffering is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And certainly in my own life, I can assess and attest that that has been the case. So putting that all together in what has probably been a muddled answer to the question, it does seem to me that you can both declare God's creation good, because it is an amazing creation, and I trust the words that were spoken by himself to describe that. At the same time, say that it need not necessarily mean that good is lacking in any evidence of mutational mistakes or other examples that may lead to humans not leading a life that's totally free of pain, and resulting therefore in a life which is, maybe we want it to be, a garden of delights, but oftentimes it's a little different. Sometimes it's even a vale of tears, and that may also be part of the good creation.
Simon, did you want to add?
I hardly dare. I mean, sorry, this is a complete monkey in this area as well. I mean, only things I would observe are two, which have both been repeated many times. The first is this is a very, very well-travelled path, but it's been going in circles for some time, so that seems to be slightly pointless. The other thing is that, as far as I'm aware, with one or two perhaps hints amongst other vertebrates, we are the only species that has ever thought this is something worth talking about.
I'm a little surprised, Francis, that you didn't mention Satan.
Well,
Because,
yes.
as you may know, anti-evolutionists are not reluctant to invoke Satan in the process and to explain many of the phenomena that seem to be troublesome to evolutionists. One of the greatest creationists of the 20th century described Satan as the great hybridizer. He brought about lots of the terrible things that we see, and so took the onus off of God. And I find it interesting, if not strange, that in a group that is quite willing to talk about God and what he might have done, there's been no mention of Satan. Do you believe in Satan?
I do, although I think my understanding of that particular entity, concept, whatever, is profoundly blurry, and I think that's probably true of many Christians, that if there is a force for good, it makes sense, there is a counterforce for evil. But to actually ascribe actions of the sort of, messing up evolution to cause us pain, that's a stretch for me, to say the least. So in not mentioning Satan, I think probably it's because it had not seriously entered my mind that that was a plausible place to lay the blame.
You see, the trouble is, Francis, I started off this morning thinking that you and I weren't far apart. And I'm going to go to bed realizing what a gulf there is between us.
Because of Satan?
Well, let's put it this way. Satan is the rather rancid cream on the top of the cake. You've already said things like, I don't think the moral law can be given a natural explanation. You're a theistic evolutionist. We've got to talk about those mutations and their randomness sometime, because I'm not sure that you're truly, genuinely committed to the randomness of mutation. And now you start invoking, you Christians have already got 3 gods, and now here comes a 4th. My God, polytheism is rampant. You can't say that the concept of Satan, it's a bit boring, I won't go into it here, it's late at night and we're in a Congregationalist college anyway. I mean, you know, you can't leave us hanging like that. Is Satan another god? Are you a Manichaean? Is Satan just a buzzword for things going wrong? Is Satan an active force or what? Somebody gets cancer. A small child gets cancer. Now, I say, you know, something went wrong. I mean, I don't mean a moral sense. I mean, something went wrong. Do you actually want to invoke Satan here and say, Satan set out to make this child's life miserable?
No, and I think I already said that I don't think of Satan as the source of mistakes in DNA copying. That I find the concept, the doctrine of Satan, to be one of the murkier ones in Christian theology. I'm not willing to either embrace it in a very traditional conservative way, because I don't quite follow why one should, nor am I willing to say that's just a lot of superstition, because it seems to me that other figures in my faith that I hold in great reverence, including Christ himself, were in fact unwilling to discount the reality of Satan. So I'm still on the road on this one.
Simon, do you want to chip in on this one? Theology?
Talk about Satan.
One could.
Well, somebody should help.
Well, I think Michael's been slightly accommodative here. It's as much to his credit as usual. I think, so far as again using these particular examples of suggesting that cancers or DNA are due to malign intervention may or may not be true, with little evidence that's the case. Most of you will recall, of course, G.K. Chesterton, one of my great heroes, if not greatest heroes, time when he was very much convinced that there were choices to be made and ways you could go and ways which would be extremely dangerous, and meeting another SC to the broadly Oscar Wilde type who decided to go in one particular direction, and he realised he too could have done the same. And in that particular context, the difference is, I think, without being a theologian, is that one is involved with personalities, one is involved with personal choices, and therefore I think it would be unwise to try and drag out, with great respect to Michael, specific instances of hospital bed dramas in the operation of radical evil. These are decisions made by people, and they are choices made by them. And as long as we know that they are doing that, and we have plenty of evidence that happens, then I think you have an arena for discussion. But I don't think that the way in which it's normally brought down to broadly Dawkins versus the rest argument in a theodicy will get us anywhere at all, I'm afraid. So it's again, we're the only species which is worried about that, but that's just a very good reason why we should worry about it, because we've been asked to worry about it, and it's a very different way of looking at the world. The world has changed completely, Michael.
Okay, here's one for you, Michael, actually, and perhaps it's sort of not unrelated, so I'll keep on this theme a little bit, but slightly different tack here. You listed in your talk 3 problems: the Bible, evil, and special status. This is coming out of your talk. Didn't you miss one important topic? The implication of Darwin that the world is meaningless, / ruled by chance, the absence of telos of whatever kind.
Well, I don't think I did actually ignore that. I think that the whole discussion about special status of humans is clearly bound up with that, particularly in the context of Christian theology. It's certainly possible, for instance, to have an Aristotelian position, let us say, where one is concerned with telos, which does not necessarily privilege human beings. But if you remember, my talk last night was in the Christian context, and I just stated categorically, and I think that people agreed with me this morning. I mean, in fact, although Francis and I think go apart after this, I did not hear anything from him that I, said, no, that wasn't my definition of Christianity. And I think that we both wanted to say that central to Christianity is the special place of humans, and this, of course, is a teleological issue. Does the world move in some, not deterministic way, but inevitable way, if you like, to the appearance of humans in the context of which I spoke last night? I mean, if we were all green or something, I don't think that would destroy the Christian message, but I'm talking about beings that are moral beings, beings and beings that are thinking beings. So at that level, I think that I was in fact grasping very fully the notion of teleology. But I'm glad you asked that, because as I say, I think that this does enable me to add that clarification, which I think is very important. Is because you're a teleologist, it does not necessarily follow that you're going to be a Christian. Plato and Aristotle were teleologists. They were not Christians. What I want to say, and I think that Francis and I are complete agreement here, is that Christian teleology is very human-centric, if I might say so.
Okay, thank you very much for that one. This is, I think, one for Francis or Simon. Your talks suggest a deistic/theistic view of the cosmos, where God designs the universe and then has it run on its own, quote unquote. That is more a deistic than a theistic view. Is your view really compatible with Christianity, where God interacts with this world all the time? Francis, do you want to have a go at that one?
Well, all theists are also deists, right? Can you think of an exception to that statement? Are there people who would believe in a personal God who don't also believe that God has dominion over the rest of the universe? Maybe there's some people out there. I don't know any. So it doesn't seem any fair to ask the question of a theist perspective, whether it's consistent to imagine that God also had a plan for the creation of the universe and the potential of setting all the parameters in a certain way to allow complexity to develop. After all, that was the way to make the universe pregnant with possibilities, which over the course of billions of years came into reality as part of the plan. At least that's what a theist like myself would say. So the question, I think, really more is, does God operate through this process? And here is a place where I'm not really clear that in my own mind I have separated out the possible answers to that question. Did God set the whole process in place, given that God is outside of time, which I believe, as Michael put forward last night, is a pretty compelling conclusion if you're going to accept the possibility of God in the first place? Then if that was so, and that even given the randomness and the uncertainty of things all the way to quantum mechanics, God might have been able to start the clock in motion with full knowledge of its outcome and not have to intervene along the way because of that full knowledge. Or, on the other hand, as a Christian, there are certain aspects of my faith where God most certainly did intervene, especially in the resurrection. And so one would argue in that case that God reserved unto himself the possibility of breaking his own natural laws when he had a very serious message to send, the most serious message of all possible messages. And I don't find that to be logically inconsistent once you accept the idea of a theistic God who cares about messages to humanity. But beyond that, does God intervene in daily activities? I think I'm deeply troubled by what I hear from many of my Christian colleagues in the United States who imagine that by putting up a particular prayer in front of God, they can manipulate his plan. That, if I pray for this parking space, it will be made available. I mean, that cheapens God to the point of being ludicrous, but there's an awful lot of conservative evangelicals in the U.S. who I think believe that exactly that will happen, and they're being encouraged by people from pulpits to tell them that that's the case. That if you didn't get what you wanted that particular week in winning the lottery, well, it's probably because you didn't pray hard enough. And that I find deeply troubling. So clearly, it must not be reasonable to imagine that God is in the practice of being manipulated that way or in intervening with daily events to break the natural laws on a minute-by-minute basis. And we wouldn't want that, or life would be so incredibly chaotic that none of us would enjoy it very much.
You may not want it, Francis, but I'd like you to know that Ron and I have been praying constantly for divine intervention this evening when the Florida State football team, the Seminoles, take on Colorado.
Because they are God's team.
We are actually expecting divine intervention, or we shall be very cheesed off given the amount we pay our coach.
Well, you can be cheesed at the coach, but I don't think God is going to be too interested in your cheesiness.
But Ron, can you help us just historically on this distinguishing between a theist and a deist? Can you just help us on a little historical background here? Because that was a little bit behind that question as well. The history here would help.
Well, they're very squishy terms, and often they've been used more by critics of the position than by people who accepted the tradition. The simplistic view is that a theist could be anybody who believes in God. And so that could be anybody from a deist to a fundamental. So theists who believe in God, and deists would be a subset of that. Deists, according to the stereotype, believe God created things and then stepped aside. But number one, there weren't many deists back in the 18th century and early 19th century. I think somebody's counted 12 in what became the United States. So it was the fear of deism that led to the big literature about, oh, there's lots of deism around. There weren't that many. And if you look at the individual deists, they all had different views on when God would, would intrude, maybe with Christ or with a judgment, or maybe never after the original creation. So that there's no, I've never been able to find a clear definition of deism that would cover all the people who claim to be deists, and certainly not all the people who were charged with being deists.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Actually, I think we'll, Ron, as you're speaking, I think this one we might start with you as well. I think it'd be good to have something really practical, just to have a little rest from theology just for a moment. Well, we're coming back to theology in a moment, so don't rest too much. But how would the panel advise school teachers in the UK and the USA, I guess other places, to address the long-standing errors and misunderstandings relating to origins and faith? What should we do differently? I mean, okay, so this is just a pragmatic, maybe asked by a teacher, I suspect, who would like to see how do we address this problem. It's more of a problem in the US than the UK, but it's here as well. So, did you want to start? It's really
I'll be happy to start.
So that, yes.
Number one, I don't think it's a total solution, but evolution needs to be taught better. I think it is taught abysmally, not only in our high schools, but in our colleges. And we educators, and especially my friends in biology, complain that more people don't believe in it, and they have only themselves to blame to a great extent. They haven't gone out of their way to instruct educated people in the United States. The only way we can legally address this topic in the U.S., I think, is through what's sometimes called social studies, or historically. You can, well within the constitutional limits, talk about what has happened, as long as you don't become an advocate for one position over another. And I might add here, this is where Michael's friend Richard Dawkins really bothers me, is that, you're a good buddy, the fundamentalists have been saying for decades, evolution is inherently atheistic. Now, biologists, such as Dawkins, are saying evolution is inherently atheistic. If it isn't inherently atheistic, and I know Michael's made the same argument at times, then it's not religiously neutral and cannot be taught in the public schools of America. And so he may well be on the way to making it impossible to teach evolution in our public schools. And he doesn't want to assume any responsibility for that.
I mean, you laugh, but you know, for once this is not a joke. I mean, this is a very serious issue. And I think that it's one that needs to be addressed. And I think Ron's absolutely right. We do need better biology teaching. I mean, I don't know what the situation in England is like now, but when I went to school in the 1950s, there were 3 grades because mine was an all-boys school, 3 grades of boys. The really bright ones, who did Latin and Greek. Then the middle-range ones, and I was one of these, who did math, physics, chemistry, and German. And then there were what they described as the late developers. And they did Spanish, woodwork, geography, and biology. I never, ever took a biology course at any time when I was a schoolboy in England. And I went to Newham School, York, which was considered, you know, already in the Which standings, one of the best schools academically that there was. I never, ever took biology at school. So I'm right with you, Ron. I mean, I think number one is to teach people what a fantastic subject this is. I mean, listening to our scientists today, you know, isn't it wonderful, the stuff that they're digging up literally and metaphorically? That's what I think we should be doing first and foremost. But as I say, I think you're absolutely right. At the same time, we've got to have some very serious theological, philosophical education and law thinking about these issues, particularly in America, in the context of science and religion and what can be taught. I pray now that, you know, now that that enthusiast, and I do not use this term with approbation, Tony Blair has left not the White House, Downing Street, and that you've got this rather, you know, British Scottish place, that you will no longer be faced with these, at least the threat of these wretched faith-based schools and things of this nature, where they are intending to teach creation science or ID or these sorts of things in the guise of biology. So it's an ongoing problem, and don't forget, the US, one thing that Bush has done is get in 2 new justices into the Supreme Court who are incredibly conservative. Already they are hammering down on things like abortion, and I can see within 5 years or so ID coming up to the Supreme Court, and I wouldn't want to make an evaluation of which way it would go.
I wouldn't either.
Francis, do you want to add
So
anything?
I have to completely agree with the incredibly sad state of biology teaching in the United States, a sad state that has been sustained over many decades. The reason that I have a PhD in quantum mechanics is because I thought biology was the most completely uninteresting topic ever invented by some scientist. It was all descriptive, it made no sense at all, it was not appealing, it had no mathematical elegance to it. It was something to be avoided, and I only discovered years after that exposure that it was actually quite an interesting topic indeed. It was well hidden, and I fear it still is today to most of the high school students that wander through public schools and private schools in the United States, who, if they have any interest in quantitative science, decide that mathematics and physics and chemistry are the only place they're going to find it, and they better move away from biology as quickly as possible. So we have a huge problem there in terms of the schools. But on the other side of this, the other aspect of the huge problem is, I think, the way in which, particularly again in the US, the evangelical church leadership is so completely aligned with an anti-evolutionist perspective, and so determined, therefore, to propagate that view as a defense against what they see as atheistic evolution, that they are making it worse, and they're making it worse year by year by year by indoctrinating their own theology students at seminary who are not given a chance to learn very much about the science either. And then this goes on, generation after generation, putting forward circumstances which people do not realize, free preaching from the pulpit, when they think they're actually telling people what they need to know, that they're propagating lies. Lies which were nobly intended in their original form, I suppose, but which are lies just the same. And unless we can both get traction on the scientific community, which clearly is needed to back off from this perspective that people like Dawkins are putting forward, but also get traction on the theological community to say, wait a minute, what are we about here? We're about truth, and we haven't been telling the truth. Then I don't see how we're going to get past the current escalating battle, which threatens to really do major damage to the culture. I have a dream here, when you could criticize, in fact, I'd be appreciative of advice. I already talked to Denis about this, about trying to bring together a small group of leading theologians, scientists, and pastors in a closed situation where no microphones are running and nobody is taking notes, to see whether we could get beyond this incredibly contentious, defensive, reactive position and say, let's all look at what the facts are, what truth God has allowed us to learn about himself through theology and about nature through science, and could we not together come up with a much more sophisticated synthesis that celebrates God's creation instead of trying to deny various aspects of it. And if we could do that in a fashion that actually began to spin out a bit in theological circles and in pastoral circles, and began therefore to send the message to the great public out there that still believes in young earth creationism, could we maybe in 20 or 30 years, probably not a lot sooner than that, actually turn the corner? Now, is that too much of a Pollyanna perspective? Is it too late for that? Is there any way
I think if you'd asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said it is a Pollyanna position and it's just not going to work. The one glimmer is that we know now that a number of evangelicals evangelicals, despite a great deal of criticism, are now starting to take a stand on environmental issues.
Yes.
And are starting to say that we evangelicals have been mistaken. Now, I don't know if that's the thin end of the wedge. I don't know. But it might be a place to start. But I don't think it's going to require concessions by us on the matter of science. We're not going to do that. But I do think it's going to require a lot more sensitivity by us on the side of science about the fears of the evangelicals. And of course, Ron, you're the expert.
There is a good historical precedent in America to encourage it. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the Copernican system was introduced, and the mechanistic philosophy associated with Boyle and Newton and others, there was virtually no empirical evidence to support it. In fact, all the empirical evidence suggested that we weren't whirling around the sun. So why did almost all Americans accept it? It was, it seems, largely because of the people who endorsed it. It was coming, especially out of England, from good Christian, or at least they were thought to be good Christian people at the time, endorsed by others in the New World. It wasn't because of any evidence for it at all. There was no good evidence for it until later. And so I think that it could make a difference that there are evangelicals such as yourself and others who would speak up, who I think have been rather quiet in the past few decades, and say, look, we are evangelicals and we believe in evolution. Most people aren't going to read enough to make an informed decision. They put their trust, I put my trust in experts. And I think you, above all the other evangelicals in America, are in a position to be trusted on this. That's a big responsibility, I know.
Right.
So if we fail in the next 25 years, it's your fault, Francis.
So, Francis, you better get to bed soon now. You know what you're wearing yourself out.
I think Simon, do you want to give a little footnote on the teaching of biology in the UK? We've heard quite a bit about the other side. I mean, because yeah. So.
I mean, again, I do so little teaching in any case, thank goodness, my students. So, I think in a way it's slightly unfair, perhaps, to point to particular areas which are being taught in what we would, I think, rightly say is distorted. There is a much wider cultural problem as to the way in which you accept belief, the way in which you accept critical analysis. And it's a paradox here because, of course, Michael in particular is only too familiar with the reality that a lot of people come to university to learn philosophy, and the reason they come is they think they're getting answers to the meaning of life, everything. Poor fools. Of course they don't. They're learning how to argue, which is more or less what scientists are meant to do. And then when you recall that probably the majority of people who teach science, and of course one thinks back to a well-known trial in Tennessee, but that's another story, are not trained scientists of any sort at all. So, in a sense, it's not quite the blind leading the blind, but it's people who are very far removed from the workplace in all sorts of ways. Then, when you go off into the land of Bloom and others, and the terms, the loss of the canon and so forth, and the notion in which there are almost an infinite number of ways of interpreting the same set of facts, the way they can be reinterpreted, I don't think you could be entirely surprised when some people who may actually have some legitimacy in this area would say, well, what is this sort of, the underdetermination of knowledge and so forth, what is the epistemology of science, start to raise question marks in the wrong sorts of hands, you can see the whole thing unravelling very quickly. So, although it's very tempting to point fingers at the inadequacy of teaching evolution or biology and those sorts of areas, and indeed those are serious problems, and I think we're coming across it more and more now in this country and in Europe, it is part of a far larger problem of disbelief, if you like. So I just, I thank goodness, as you probably realise, don't do this sort of thing very often, but when one is being always sort of forced to adopt particular positions, you're always being painted into particular corners even when the discussion began. I don't have any quarrel with being a deist or a theist or anything else. Those are fine and large, but they automatically denote positions of apparent strength or apparent weakness. Whereas, of course, in the intellectual tradition, we're not here to talk about things. Of course, I agree with Michael, we need definitions, we have to know where we're going to start, we have to know how the argument's going to be But in terms of science, the sorts of things we're doing are, in their own way, far more interesting than just merely putting positions in a rather sort of boring drafts game. It's not even chess anymore.
Okay, thank you. I think we're not going to keep going very much longer. We normally do these panels for an hour, so we'll probably keep going for another 5 minutes, and then we'll draw stumps, as we say. Now, by the way, I just want to say I had a great biology teacher at school. Wonderful. I actually changed from the maths 6 to the biology 6 and took the benefit of having this great biology teacher. I just say that for biology teachers out here as well. There are some great biology teachers, yeah, so I think that some teaching of biology is wonderful. We are going to do a little bit more theology. And actually here's one for Michael. The idea God is... Well, it's addressed...
If my headmaster could see me now, we now have a theology question for Michael. My goodness.
This is a question about Satanism. No.
Oh, I am an expert on that.
Michael, this is your life. Could we please welcome the headmaster? We'll do that next time. Okay, here's the question. The idea God is outside of time is an Augustinian concept taken in by theologians readily. But theologians like John Polkinghorne and other cosmologists suggest otherwise, especially invoking the uncertainty in quantum mechanics and suggesting that God doesn't actually want to know the future, or perhaps God doesn't know the future. So you took a very Augustinian view. Many theologians don't take that view. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, one could, I think, perhaps at a wider level mention process theology, the theology of Whitehead, which of course is very much a theology which sees God, as it were, as down here with his sleeves rolled up, working alongside us. And my very good friend, the Lutheran pastor at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, Phil Hefner, is always talking about God as co-creator along with us. Of course, at one level, what am I to say? I don't want to deny the right of people to do this, and certainly when I meet somebody like Phil Hefner, it would be arrogant beyond belief to suggest that Phil is not a genuine Christian. I mean, of all the human beings I know, nobody has lived his life more aware of the fact that his Saviour died on the cross for his salvation. I don't think Phil takes anything in a literal sense, but by God, he takes it as true, and it really is true for him. So I'm not going to say that if you are a Whiteheadian, you're not a genuine Christian. Having said that, I'm a deeply conservative non-believer. Speaking personally, I think that Whiteheadian philosophy is heretical through and through. In fact, I probably sound like some of the people who ran this place when they come to think about, the Catholic Church, for instance. I don't know what to say. I mean, obviously, people are going to take different positions, and if they want to take it, I'm certainly not going to stop them. And unlike Dawkins, I'm not going to stop working with them. I'm not going to say, I'm too pure for you, you're outside, you're evil, etc., etc. I'm willing to work with them. But as I understand traditional Christianity, it is absolutely fundamental that God stands outside time. And I want to say more than this. I think theologically, philosophically, valuably, I think that this is a better position. And of course, it solves some problems if you bring God into the business. It does solve these issues like how do you deal with malmutations and those sorts of things, because at some level God has voluntarily given up, kenosis. God has voluntarily given up some of his powers to work alongside us. So I'm not saying there's no biblical justification for it. However, I think if you're trying to give an overall picture, and when you're starting to deal with issues like creation and meaning, and of course trying to solve some of the problems that I was trying to solve last night, I think St. Augustine still has one hell of a lot going for him.
Okay. We might make this the last, and then we'll draw stumps. So I think, Francis, this is one last one for you.
Is it theological?
It is a little bit. Yeah, it's somewhat. Well, let's see what you think. So, do you think the Human Genome Project will shed light on the origin of conscience? imagine a consciousness, which is said to be unique to humans? If so, do you think it would add weight to an atheist argument that God doesn't exist? So it's saying, yeah. Okay.
Yes, no.
Is that it? You want to go to bed?
So certainly the phenomenon of consciousness must have some anatomic neuroscientific basis, a basis that we are having a very difficult time uncovering and I think have not made a whole lot of progress on in quite some time. But that doesn't mean that it will not ultimately reveal itself in terms of what are the neurotransmitters and connections that are at least necessary for this phenomenon to occur. And the human genome, as after all the instruction book that presumably encodes for all of the various components of human biology, therefore would have to be implicated if we get to that point as containing some of those answers. I don't know how soon that will happen, or even whether it will happen to our complete satisfaction for a very long time. Consciousness is not sort of an easily defined parameter after all. In terms of whether that would have any impact on our perceptions of God as the creator, I don't see, once you've accepted the idea that God used the mechanism of evolution with an intention of bringing into being sentient creatures who would have consciousness and who would have an interest in having conversations like this about whether he exists or not, it doesn't seem to me that it's a particular stretch to say that the evolutionary mechanism was involved in generating that kind of higher level brain function, including the existence of consciousness itself. So it doesn't seem actually any more relevant to the question of God's existence than to some of the observations about particular brain functions during the times when people are engaged in deep meditation. It's simply a reflection of the fact that there has to be some biological correlate to aspects of human experience, including some human experiences that are really quite luminous. And I don't see that as a philosophical or even a theological problem.
This is so interesting, Francis, because it seems to me that now you're coming back to Francis I loved all last night.
Oh, I feel so much better now, Michael. I was afraid you and I couldn't be friends after that earlier comment.
Oh, we can still be friends. It seems to me now you are taking a position with which I am perfectly comfortable. And yet when it came to the moral law, you wanted to flip in God, especially there, and that's what worries me. I mean, if you want to say to me, of course consciousness is bound up at some level with material, it obviously transcends it in some way, and I as a Christian, of course, think that this is an overall evidence of God's working his way out. I've got no objections to that. But the thing is, it sounded to me that this morning you wanted to say, I accept all of that with respect to the moral law, but I want a little bit more. I want that chap up there, as it were, coming down and somehow inserting in my brain, not just physically through Jesus giving us the word, but somehow, you know, that direct connection, that telephone line, because these days I suppose you do it in an email from God. Love your neighbour as yourself, Francis Collins, otherwise I'll set Satan on you.
So Michael, you are a master at the Dawkins approach of misrepresenting your opponent's
That's not Francis talking, that's something else.
That was not Satan, no, that was me. So I don't think I said anything of the kind. I did say in this discussion about the moral law, and I would like your response to this one, that if one does want to look at the moral law from an absolutely pure atheistic evolutionary perspective, that it leads you to the conclusion that the concepts of good and evil are purely arbitrary and illusory, and that we should therefore make a decision, now that we're so smart about it all, to just ignore those concepts altogether and not be enthralled to something which is basically an evolutionary hoodwinking. And yet I don't hear atheists or skeptics or anybody saying that that's really a desirable step that they want to take. So isn't that actually a fairly significant argument to lodge against a completely naturalistic explanation for the moral law, and doesn't it deserve a response?
No, I don't. Well, it deserves a response, but I'm on record as saying I think that morality is a side effect, an illusion put in place by our genes to keep us as moral operators or social operators. Because we can't. This is the point that Dostoevsky makes in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov finds that because of his nature, he is unable to break from it. I might, okay, let's say, you know, Ron has discovered I pinched some ideas in my last book, so, you know, tonight I pad down the hall and bump him off. But the thing is, does it mean that, you know, I might say,
Lock the door,
you know, but I know that I, as a social being, I'm going to feel really badly tomorrow morning when Denis says, "Where's Ron? Where's Ron? Has anybody seen Ron?" Somebody said, "Well, there's a funny smell coming from his room this morning." You know what I mean? And what am I going to be doing? I'm going to be sitting there feeling so awful because of what I've done. So I would say I'm a Humean. I think that philosophy leads to total skepticism. But as Hume says, we find it terrible, we go and play a game of backgammon, we have a meal with our friends, and it all seems dry and strained. I think that philosophy leads to skepticism, but thankfully, psychology rescues us from it.
It's the first time I've heard psychology rescuing me from anything.
Well, we're just warming up the panel. Maybe we should keep going. I think probably though, I think we have worked our speakers and our panel very hard indeed, and we have a lot of questions on the table still unanswered. Sorry about that for those, come back next time, maybe we'll get to those. But let's really thank our panel very much for their contribution.